When my ruthless boss stole the $150,000 inheritance my grandmother left me, he thought I was just another powerless employee who wouldn't fight back. But he didn't know I was willing to risk everything to take him down. Armed with insider knowledge and years of buried resentment, I uncovered his web of lies, fraudulent contracts, embezzled funds, and even stolen retirement accounts. As I meticulously dismantled his empire, I exposed his crimes to the IRS, the media, and his most trusted clients. But just when I thought the game was over and I'd finally won, the unimaginable happened: my boss faked his death. Now, with nothing left to lose, he's coming after me with a vengeance, determined to ruin my life, just as I ruined his. The hunter has become the hunted in this twisted game of revenge, and the only question left is, who will win? A gripping tale of betrayal, justice, and the unexpected consequences of revenge. This story will keep you on the edge of your seat until the very last twist. The funeral was quiet, almost serene, with the faint scent of lilies wafting through the air. My grandmother had been the kind of person who brought calmness into every room she entered, and even in death, it seemed she was still doing so. As I stood by her casket, I couldn't help but feel the weight of the world pressing down on me. She'd been my anchor, my only family left, and now she was gone. My mother had left when I was barely 5, and my father, well, he wasn't the kind of man you wanted in your life. Grandma had raised me, nurtured me, and pushed me to be better than my circumstances. She used to say, no matter how small the flame, it can still light up the darkness. That little saying had carried me through some of the hardest times in my life. After the service, I sat in a stuffy lawyer's office, nervously twisting the strap of my bag as I waited to hear the details of her will. I wasn't expecting much, she'd been living modestly for as long as I could remember. But when the lawyer cleared his throat and read the words aloud, I froze. She'd left me her entire savings. $150,000. I stared at the lawyer, my mouth slightly open, unsure if I'd heard him correctly. She wanted you to have a fresh start, he said, sliding the paperwork across the desk. She mentioned it multiple times in her instructions. She was very clear about that. A fresh start. Those words hung in the air like a lifeline. For years, I'd been stuck in a dead-end job as a personal assistant to Martin Grayson, a man who made me feel smaller than an ant under a magnifying glass. He had this way of making you feel like you were lucky to even breathe the same air as him, constantly reminding everyone that he was the one in charge. The job wasn't glamorous, but I didn't have many options. I was buried in student loans, living paycheck to paycheck, and barely scraping by. The idea of leaving had always felt like a distant dream, something I couldn't afford to consider. But now things were different. I walked out of that lawyer's office with tears in my eyes and hope in my heart. For the first time in years, I felt like maybe, just maybe, my life was about to change. The next day at work, I made the mistake of mentioning the inheritance to a coworker, Lisa. We were eating lunch in the break room, and I let it slip in the middle of a conversation about dreams and aspirations. Her eyes widened, and she leaned in close, lowering her voice to a whisper. "Are you serious?" "That's amazing," she said, a little too enthusiastically. I nodded, feeling a strange mix of pride and guilt. "Yeah, it's a lot to process. I'm still figuring out what to do with it." Lisa didn't mean any harm, I'm sure. But within days, word spread around the office. And, of course, it eventually reached Martin. It happened on a Friday afternoon. I was at my desk, typing up notes from a meeting, when he called me into his office. His tone was unusually friendly, almost too friendly. I should have known then that something was off. When I walked in, he was leaning back in his chair, a smug smile plastered across his face. "I hear congratulations are in order," he said, gesturing for me to sit down. I hesitated but sat anyway, clutching my notepad like it was a shield. "Thank you," I said cautiously. "I understand you've come into a bit of money recently," he continued, his eyes gleaming like a predator who'd just spotted prey. "That's wonderful news. Truly. And you know, I'd hate to see you waste it." There it was. The hook. "What do you mean?" I asked, even though I already had a sinking feeling in my gut. "Well," he said, leaning forward, "I happen to know a thing or two about investing. In fact, I've made some very lucrative deals over the years. If you'd like, I could help you grow that money. Triple it, even. You could be sitting on $500,000 in no time. I didn't know much about investing, but I knew Martin. He was slick, always looking for an angle, always finding ways to benefit himself. Still, the idea of making more money was tempting. My grandmother's voice echoed in my mind, a fresh start. Wouldn't it be amazing to turn that $150,000 into something even bigger? I told him I'd think about it, and over the weekend, he bombarded me with emails and texts, sending charts and testimonials, insisting he could make me rich beyond my wildest dreams. He was persistent, almost desperate. By Monday, I caved. I transferred the money into an account he'd set up for me. "Trust me," he said with a wide grin. "You're going to thank me for this." But weeks turned into months, and the money didn't grow. In fact, I didn't see any returns at all. Every time I asked about it, Martin had a new excuse. "The market's a bit slow right now," he'd say. Or, "These things take time. You've got to be patient." At first, I believed him. But then I started noticing little things, like the brand new sports car he bought or the extravagant vacation photos he posted online. The more I thought about it, the more I realized something wasn't adding up. One night, I decided to look into the account myself. Martin had given me login credentials when we first set it up, but when I tried to access it, the password didn't work. I tried resetting it, but the account wasn't even under my name. That's when the panic set in. The next day, I confronted him. "Martin, I need to know what's going on with my money," I said, standing in his office with my arms crossed. He looked up from his computer, unfazed. "What do you mean?" "I mean I tried to access the account, and I couldn't. The password doesn't work. And why isn't the account in my name?" He leaned back in his chair, a smug smile spreading across his face. "Oh, that. Don't worry about it. Everything's fine. I've got it under control." "No," I snapped, my voice shaking. "It's not fine. Where is my money, Martin?" He sighed dramatically, like I was an inconvenience. "Look, if you're going to get all paranoid, maybe this wasn't such a good idea after all. But unfortunately for you, it's a little too late to back out now." "What does that mean?" I demanded. "It means," he said, standing up and towering over me, "that you don't have any proof. And even if you did, who do you think they'd believe? Me, a respected CEO? Or you, my assistant who can't even afford a decent car?" His words hit me like a slap to the face. He wasn't just stealing from me, he was mocking me, reveling in my helplessness. But he underestimated me. I didn't say anything else. I just turned and walked out of his office, my mind racing. He thought he could get away with it, that I'd just roll over and accept my fate. But he was wrong. I wasn't going to let him get away with this. Not this time. The weight of Martin's smug grin stayed with me long after I left his office that day. My hands trembled with anger, but beneath the fury, a plan was already beginning to take shape. I wouldn't let him steal from me, not without consequences. If he thought I was just a powerless assistant, he was about to find out how wrong he was. The first step was finding proof. Martin had made it clear that without evidence, I didn't stand a chance. But I had spent years working for him, running his errands, filing his papers, and sitting through meetings where he made underhanded deals with a wink and a handshake. I knew there had to be something, some thread I could pull to unravel his lies. That night, after everyone had left the office, I stayed behind. I told security I had a project to finish and needed extra time, which wasn't unusual for me. They didn't question it. By now, they were used to seeing me burn the midnight oil while Martin enjoyed his lavish dinners and late-night parties. Once the building was empty, I slipped into his office. My heart was pounding so hard it felt like it might burst out of my chest. The room smelled faintly of expensive cologne and leather, and the massive desk in the center looked more like a throne than a workspace. I started with his computer. I knew his password. It was one of the few things I'd learned early on while helping him set up new devices. He wasn't exactly creative, Grayson 123. I logged in without a hitch. Emails, files, spreadsheets, it was all there. And it didn't take long for me to find what I was looking for. Buried in a folder labeled Personal were records of multiple bank accounts, some under his name and others under fake names or shell companies. I cross-referenced the account numbers with the transfer receipts for my inheritance, and there it was, my $150,000, funneled directly into one of his private accounts. But that wasn't all I found. There were emails between Martin and his accountant detailing tax fraud, falsified expenses, and other illegal schemes. He'd been cooking the books for years, inflating his profits to attract investors while quietly pocketing the difference. There were contracts with clients that included shady kickbacks and under-the-table deals. And, perhaps most damning of all, there were documents proving he'd embezzled money from his own employees' retirement funds. My hands shook as I copied everything onto a flash drive. The sheer scope of his corruption was staggering. This wasn't just about me anymore. Martin had been screwing over everyone around him for years, and no one had dared to challenge him. Until now. The next step was figuring out how to use the evidence. I couldn't go to the police yet, not without making sure I had an airtight case. Martin had lawyers on speed dial, and I knew he'd try to bury me in legal fees if I made a move without being fully prepared. I decided to start small. The company had several key clients, and I knew that Martin's reputation was the only thing keeping them loyal. If they found out about his shady dealings, they'd drop him in a heartbeat. I carefully selected one of the biggest clients, a high-profile tech startup that relied on our company for software development. I sent an anonymous email to their CEO, attaching copies of the fraudulent contracts Martin had drawn up with them. I explained that their company's name was being tied to illegal activities and that they might want to reconsider their partnership. The response was swift. Within days, they terminated their contract. Martin was furious, storming around the office and yelling at anyone who crossed his path. He blamed the loss on incompetent staff, but I could see the cracks beginning to form. One by one, I went after the other clients, each time sending anonymous tips with just enough evidence to make them question their relationship with Martin's company. It was like watching a tower of dominoes collapse in slow motion. But I wasn't done yet. I needed to hit Martin where it hurt the most, his wallet. And that meant going after his personal finances. Using the information I'd gathered from his files, I reported his fraudulent activities to the IRS. It was surprisingly easy. They even had an online form for submitting tips about tax evasion. I attached all the documentation I had and hit submit, feeling a strange mix of fear and satisfaction. It didn't take long for the IRS to take action. Within weeks, Martin's accounts were frozen, and his assets were under investigation. The news hit the office like a bombshell. Employees whispered in hushed tones as Martin tried to keep up appearances, but it was clear that he was struggling. The new car. Repossessed. The luxury vacations. Cancelled. Even his house was suddenly up for sale, though he tried to spin it as a smart business move. Watching him squirm was satisfying, but I knew it wasn't enough. He still didn't know it was me, and I wasn't ready to reveal my hand just yet. Then came the moment I'd been waiting for. One afternoon, as I was sitting at my desk, Martin called me into his office. His usual confidence was gone, replaced by a nervous edge that made him seem almost human. "I need you to do something for me," he said, avoiding eye contact. "What is it?" I asked, trying to keep my voice neutral. "There's been some misunderstandings with the IRS. I need you to go through the company records and make sure everything is in order. We can't afford any mistakes right now." I wanted to laugh in his face. He was asking me, the person he'd stolen from, to help him cover his tracks. "Of course," I said, forcing a smile. "I'll get right on it." As I left his office, I felt a surge of power. For the first time in years, I wasn't afraid of Martin. He was losing control, and he didn't even realize how much of it was because of me. But I wasn't finished yet. This was just the beginning. It was strange, the calm that settled over me as I watched Martin's empire crumble. I'd expected to feel pure exhilaration or maybe guilt creeping in at the edges, but instead, I felt nothing but quiet determination. This wasn't just about getting my money back anymore. This was about justice, for me, for the coworkers he'd belittled, for the clients he'd scammed, and for anyone else who'd been foolish enough to trust him. The office was tense. Rumors swirled that the IRS investigation was heating up, and Martin's behavior was spiraling. He was snapping at people, holding endless closed-door meetings with the legal team, and spending hours in his office, pacing like a caged animal. Even his golden boy swagger couldn't hide the panic creeping into his eyes. I made sure to stay under the radar. I kept my head down, pretending to be as clueless and overworked as everyone else. But behind the scenes, I was laying the groundwork for the next phase of my plan. It started with the employees. Martin had spent years convincing everyone that they owed their jobs, and their livelihoods, to him. He used fear to control us, constantly reminding us how easily we could be replaced. But I knew the truth. I'd seen the files, unpaid bonuses, illegal deductions from paychecks, and retirement funds that were accidentally mismanaged. So, I became a whisper in the wind. I started small, planting seeds of doubt during casual conversations in the break room or while riding the elevator with coworkers. Do you ever wonder why our raises are always delayed? I asked one woman from HR, pretending it was just idle chatter. Another time, I mentioned to a junior developer that I'd heard Martin wasn't contributing as much to the 401k program as he claimed. I don't know, I said with a shrug. Maybe it's just a rumor. The whispers spread. Soon, employees were grumbling about missing bonuses, questioning discrepancies in their paychecks, and demanding answers from HR. The tension reached a boiling point when one of the senior managers, a man who'd been with the company for over a decade, decided to quit on the spot. He stormed out of the office, shouting about financial misconduct and a boss who couldn't be trusted. I watched it all unfold with quiet satisfaction. Martin was losing control, and he knew it. The next step was taking things public. Up until now, I'd been operating in the shadows, but I needed a bigger spotlight to bring Martin down completely. That's where the media came in. Using an anonymous email account, I contacted a local journalist who specialized in uncovering corporate scandals. I fed her everything, the fraudulent contracts, the embezzlement, the IRS investigation, and even the files I'd found about the retirement fund theft. It didn't take long for the story to blow up. The headline hit the front page of the business section, Tech CEO under investigation for fraud, embezzlement, and tax evasion. The article painted a damning picture of Martin as a greedy, unscrupulous businessman who'd built his success on lies. It quoted anonymous sources, some of the employees I'd quietly nudged into speaking out, and included specific details about the missing retirement funds and unpaid bonuses. When the story broke, the office descended into chaos. Reporters were calling non-stop, trying to get statements from Martin or anyone else who'd talk. Employees huddled in groups, whispering about what this meant for the future of the company. Investors started pulling out, and stock prices plummeted. And Martin? He locked himself in his office for most of the day, emerging only once to bark orders at his assistant, who wasn't me, thank God, and demand that the PR team fix this mess. But there was no fixing it. The damage was done. With the company in shambles, I turned my attention back to Martin's personal finances. I'd already reported him to the IRS, but now I wanted to make sure he felt the full weight of his actions. Using the flash drive of evidence I'd collected, I filed a lawsuit against him for theft, fraud, and breach of fiduciary duty. I knew I couldn't afford a high-powered lawyer, but I didn't need one. The evidence was ironclad, and with the IRS already breathing down his neck, I knew I had leverage. When Martin was served with the lawsuit, he called me into his office. For the first time since I'd known him, he looked genuinely rattled. His usual confidence was gone, replaced by a thin veneer of control that cracked the moment I sat down. "I don't know what you think you're doing," he said, his voice low and threatening. "But you're making a huge mistake." "I'm just holding you accountable, Martin," I replied calmly. His jaw tightened, and for a moment, I thought he might actually explode. But then he leaned back in his chair, his eyes narrowing as he studied me. "You don't have the resources to fight me," he said. "You're going to run out of money long before this ever sees a courtroom." "Maybe," I said with a shrug. But I'm willing to bet the IRS won't. The mention of the IRS was like a dagger to his chest. He flinched, his face going pale as he realized just how deep he was in. Look, he said, switching tactics. Let's be reasonable. I'll make you a deal. I'll pay you back, every cent. We don't need to involve the courts or the media. This can stay between us. I almost laughed. After everything he'd done, after all the lives he'd ruined, he thought he could just buy his way out of this? No, I said firmly. You don't get to walk away from this. Not this time. His mask slipped then, and for the first time, I saw the real Martin Grayson, the desperate, scared little man hiding behind all the bluster and bravado. You'll regret this, he spat. I'll make sure of it. But I wasn't afraid of him anymore. The lawsuit didn't just hit Martin financially, it destroyed what little was left of his reputation. Investors pulled out completely, employees resigned in droves, and the company officially declared bankruptcy within a month. Martin tried to save face, issuing a statement claiming he was stepping down to focus on personal matters, but no one bought it. His name became synonymous with greed and corruption, and every bridge he'd ever built was burned to the ground. And me? I finally got my money back. The courts ruled in my favor, awarding me not just the $150,000 he'd stolen, but also damages for the stress and financial hardship he'd caused me. It wasn't about the money anymore, though. It was about proving to myself, and to him, that he couldn't get away with what he'd done. As I walked out of the courthouse that day, I felt lighter than I had in years. Martin had once told me I was replaceable, that I was nothing without him. But in the end, it was him who lost everything. And I had finally won. With Martin officially out of my life, I should have felt complete. After all, I'd done what most people only fantasize about, I'd taken down the man who wronged me. The courts had ruled in my favor, I'd exposed his corruption to the world, and I'd gotten my money back. By all accounts, I'd won. But victory wasn't as sweet as I thought it would be. I still woke up some nights in a cold sweat, thinking about how close I'd come to losing everything. I still replayed his threats in my head, the way he'd snarled at me in his office, promising I'd regret what I'd done. And though his downfall had been thoroughly public, I couldn't shake the feeling that Martin wasn't the kind of man to simply disappear quietly into the shadows. There was something about him, a lurking threat, a predator waiting for his moment. I tried to push the paranoia aside. I'd won. It was over. Or so I thought. It started with small, strange things. The first time, I chalked it up to coincidence. I was at the grocery store, loading up my cart with fresh vegetables, when I saw a man in a baseball cap and sunglasses watching me. He didn't approach me, but I felt his eyes on me the entire time I shopped. When I left the store, I noticed him sitting in a black sedan, parked a few spaces down. But when I turned to look again, the car was gone. Then my email started acting up. I got a message from an unknown sender with no subject line and no text, just an attachment. I didn't open it. Something about it felt off, so I forwarded it to a friend who worked in IT. His response came back almost immediately, that was malware. Someone was trying to hack you. Be careful. The paranoia I'd been trying to suppress came flooding back. Was it Martin? Had he really been defeated, or was he trying to claw his way back into my life? I told myself it was unlikely, he was bankrupt, disgraced, and under investigation by the IRS. He couldn't possibly have the resources to come after me. Could he? A week later, I got my answer. I was sitting at home, sipping coffee and scrolling through my phone, when I saw the headline, Disgraced Tech CEO Martin Grayson Found Dead in Apparent Suicide. I froze. The article was vague, as if the reporter didn't quite believe what they were writing. It said Martin had been found in his hotel room, an empty bottle of pills on the nightstand. No note. No sign of foul play. Just a man who'd lost everything and decided to end it all. For a moment, I didn't know what to feel. Relief? Guilt? Closure? Martin had been my enemy, but I'd never wanted him dead. At least, not really. I stared at the headline, trying to process the news, when my phone buzzed with a text. It was from an unknown number. The message was simple: "Did you think it would be that easy?" I stared at the screen, my heart pounding. Was this some kind of sick joke? I typed back, "Who is this?" The reply came almost instantly: "Check your front door." I didn't move at first. My apartment was silent except for the faint hum of the refrigerator, but I suddenly felt like I wasn't alone. Slowly, I got up and walked to the door, my hands shaking. I peered through the peephole but didn't see anyone. After a moment of hesitation, I unlocked the door and opened it. There was no one there. But sitting on the welcome mat was a small, unmarked envelope. I picked it up carefully, my breath catching in my throat, and tore it open. Inside was a single piece of paper with a short message typed in bold letters: "The game isn't over." I spent the next few days in a state of paranoia, jumping at every shadow and flinching at every unexpected noise. I went to the police with the text messages and the note, but they weren't much help. "Probably just a prank," the officer said dismissively. "Some people have nothing better to do." I wasn't so sure. I tried to go back to normal life, but the unease lingered. Then, one evening, I got a call from Lisa, my old coworker. We hadn't spoken much since everything went down, but her voice was frantic. "Have you seen the news?" she asked. "No," I said, my stomach sinking. "Why?" "Martin's alive." My blood ran cold. "What?" "He faked his death. It's all over the news. Someone spotted him in the Cayman Islands. There are photos, he's sitting on a yacht, drinking champagne like nothing happened." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. How? How could Martin have pulled this off? Why would he fake his death? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Lisa hesitated. "I don't know, but there's something else. There are rumors that he's coming after the people who went after him." I hung up the phone without saying goodbye, my mind racing. The text messages. The note. It all made sense now. Martin wasn't just alive, he was playing a new game, and I was still his target. The next morning, I woke up to another text from the unknown number: "You ruined my life. Now I'm going to ruin yours." And just like that, my life started to unravel. It began with my job. Out of nowhere, my boss called me into his office and said there'd been complaints about me, claims that I'd been mishandling client accounts and falsifying reports. I knew it wasn't true, but the accusations were enough to get me put on probation. Then my bank account was frozen. When I called to find out why, they told me there was a pending investigation into suspicious activity. I tried to explain that it wasn't me, but they wouldn't budge. And then the emails started. Messages to my landlord, my friends, even distant relatives, all claiming I was a thief, a liar, a criminal. Martin was dismantling my life piece by piece, just as I'd done to him. I thought about going to the police again, but I knew it wouldn't help. Martin was smart, calculating. He wouldn't leave any evidence tying himself to the chaos he was causing. And even if I could prove it was him, what could they do? He was outside the country, untouchable. I had no choice but to fight back. Late one night, I opened my laptop and logged into the account I'd used to gather evidence against Martin months ago. I still had access to his files, his emails, his secrets. If he wanted a war, I'd give him one. But as I started digging, I found something I hadn't expected. Buried deep in one of his old email threads was a message to someone I didn't recognize, a man named Victor Reyes. The subject line read, "Contingency Plan." I clicked on it, and my stomach dropped. The email contained instructions for transferring assets to offshore accounts, erasing digital footprints, and setting up a new identity. It also included a chilling line: "If anyone gets too close, eliminate them." I realized then that Martin wasn't just trying to ruin me. He was trying to destroy me completely. And I had no idea how far he'd go to make it happen. As I stared at the screen, my phone buzzed again. Another text from the unknown number: "You took everything from me. Now I'll take everything from you, starting with your life." I looked out the window, but the street was empty. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me. I didn't know where Martin was or what his next move would be, but one thing was clear, this wasn't over. Not by a long shot.